Hi everyone. Tonight we are trading your pillow for a bundle of raw wool, your nightstand for a stack of 600-year-old parchment, and your quiet street for an alleyway so narrow you'll be on a first-name basis with both walls by sundown. Welcome to Fez, Morocco, home to a library so old it was already ancient by the time most of Europe figured out a library needed more than one book chained to a desk. This isn't the sun-drenched postcard version of Morocco, all warm filters and suspiciously symmetrical rugs. This is the real Fez, dye-stained, mule-scented, and thoroughly gloriously confusing. Before you get too comfortable with that mental image, a small favour. If you find yourself enjoying these nightly detours into other people's centuries, feel free to like the video and subscribe, mostly because it helps a very small channel find its footing, not because I'll lose any sleep over it either way. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what your clock says right now. Because apparently, there is never a wrong hour for this particular channel. And if your eyes are already losing the fight, the show now lives on Spotify too, tucked into the description for exactly this kind of night. Go ahead and kill the overhead light. Leave just enough glow in the room to find your own feet. And settle in the way you would before a long trip you didn't quite pack enough for. Let's wonder about a few things before we go any further. Could you find your way through a city with no street signs, no straight lines, and something like 9,000 alleyways, several of which were designed specifically to confuse invading armies? Would you survive haggling over a teapot with a man who has been haggling since before your grandparents were born? Could you handle a bathhouse where a total stranger scrubs your back harder than your own mother ever dared? And what exactly does it take to keep a library's books alive for over 1,000 years, when your own paperback swells up like a sponge if it so much as breathes near a bathtub? Well, you're about to find out. Congratulations, you've just arrived in Fez, Morocco, in the year 1357. You've got a donkey you never asked for, a guide who communicates exclusively in riddles, and precisely zero sense of direction. Welcome to the oldest library on Earth. Try not to get lost on the way to the bookshelf. You step through Bab Boujlaud, the great horseshoe gate, tiled blue on the outside for the city that built it, and green on the inside for the faith that runs it. Though nobody pauses to explain any of that, because you are already being carried forward by a current of mules, merchants, and men balancing towers of bread trays on their heads. The old city swallows you whole in your first 10 seconds. And somewhere in the noise, your guide keeps repeating one word, like it should mean something to you. Qarawiyyin. It will. Give it a minute. Let's talk about that first 10 seconds, because nothing back home prepares you for it. You've been dropped, without warning, into a river of foot traffic, moving at a pace nobody agreed on, but everybody somehow follows. A boy squeezes past with a wheelbarrow of oranges. A man leads 2 mules loaded with sacks of something that smells faintly of cumin. Somewhere behind you, a voice is shouting, "Balak, balak," which you will learn means "watch out," usually about half a second before you need to have watched out. There are no crosswalks here, no polite 4-way stops, no unspoken system of eye contact and nodding that keeps pedestrian traffic orderly. There is only motion, and your job is to become part of it or get run over by a donkey named something you'll never know. The air itself arrives in layers. The way the city will teach you everything arrives in layers. Wood smoke drifts from somewhere unseen. Fresh mint, crushed underfoot by the market stalls, cuts through it. Somewhere beneath all of that sits the low, earthy smell of animal and dust and centuries of foot traffic packed into stone. It is not unpleasant, exactly. It is simply a lot, all at once. The way your first bite of a dish with 17 spices in it is a lot, all at once, before you learn to separate the flavors. Your guide, meanwhile, has already stopped explaining anything useful and started gesturing vaguely toward buildings you can't quite see over the crowd. This is apparently standard practice. Ask a local for directions in Fez El Bali, and you'll often get a hand wave toward a general horizon rather than a street name, mostly because the streets rarely bothered with names to begin with, and even when they did, nobody particularly agreed on them. It's the medieval equivalent of asking your phone for directions and having it simply say, "That way, probably," before losing signal entirely. What you slowly start to notice, underneath all the noise and confusion, is that this chaos has a shape to it. The crowd isn't random. It moves the way water moves through a canyon, following channels worn smooth by centuries of exactly this kind of foot traffic: morning deliveries, afternoon errands, evening prayer crowds, all pouring through the same narrow gaps at the same rough hours every single day. You simply haven't learned to read it yet. Give it a week, your guide assures you, and you'll move through here like you were born to it. Give it about 4 minutes, you privately suspect, and you'll be found wandering in circles, muttering the word Qarawiyyin like a magic spell that hasn't kicked in yet. And that, appropriately enough, is exactly where you're headed. Somewhere past this wall of noise, tucked so deep into the Medina that entire generations of visitors have walked directly past it without noticing, sits the reason any of this city exists at all. You just have to survive the walk there first. Your guide finally stops muttering and simply points, and there it is, wedged so seamlessly into the surrounding houses that you nearly walked past the most important building in the entire city without noticing. No dome rises above the rooftops to announce it, no grand facade, just a modest green-tiled roof peeking out among 1,000 identical ones. It is, you will learn, doing exactly what it has done for over 1,000 years, quietly outlasting everything flashier built around it. Let's sit with that disappointment for a second, because it is, in its own way, the whole point. You were half expecting something like the great cathedrals or palaces you've seen in postcards, soaring towers, gilded domes, a building that announces its own importance from 3 streets away. Instead, you get a wall. A perfectly nice wall, admittedly, made of packed earth and stone, but a wall all the same, indistinguishable at a glance from the houses, workshops and storerooms pressed up against it on every side. The Qarawiyyin was never built to be looked at from the outside. It was built to be entered, and everything worth seeing lives on the inside, hidden from the street like a secret kept on purpose. This, it turns out, is a pattern across the entire city. Fez does not do grand exteriors. Wealthy merchants' homes, elaborate courtyards, even the most beautiful buildings in the Medina tend to present a plain, almost stubbornly modest face to the passing public, saving every ounce of decoration and ambition for the private space within. Imagine if the fanciest restaurant in your city looked, from the sidewalk, exactly like a hardware store. No sign, no valet, no hint of what's happening behind the door. That's more or less the local philosophy. Ostentation, as a concept, simply didn't catch on here the way it did elsewhere.
You crane your neck anyway, looking for some clue, some hint of grandeur peeking over the rooftop line. And eventually you spot it. A sliver of green tile, glimpsed between two washing lines strung between buildings, catching the afternoon light in a way that suggests, quietly, that there's more going on behind that wall than the wall is letting on. A few pigeons have claimed the roofline as their own personal kingdom, entirely unbothered by the fact that they're currently perched atop what will become, depending on how you count these things, either the oldest library or the oldest degree-granting institution still functioning anywhere on Earth. They do not seem impressed. Pigeons rarely are. Your guide, sensing your confusion, offers the closest thing to an explanation you'll get all day. This place has never needed to shout. It has simply outlasted every empire that tried to compete with it, one quiet century at a time, while flashier buildings around it crumbled, burned, or were rebuilt by someone with more money and less patience. There is something almost insulting about how unbothered it looks, like a marathon runner lightly jogging past you while you're doubled over trying not to be sick. So you follow your guide closer, past a fruit seller entirely uninterested in the historical weight of his own storefront, toward the wall, and toward the door that will, in a moment, make sense of everything the outside so deliberately refused to explain. To understand why this unassuming rooftop matters so much, you need to go back nearly 500 years before your arrival, to a wealthy merchant's daughter named Fatima al-Fihri, who inherited a fortune after her father's death and, rather than spend it on anything sensible, poured every last coin into building a mosque for her adopted city. She fasted the entire time construction lasted, reportedly as a personal act of devotion, which is either the most committed building project in history or the world's least relaxing home renovation. Picture the scale of what she was actually attempting for a moment. This wasn't a small chapel or a private prayer room tucked behind her family's home. This was a full mosque, built from the ground up, funded entirely by one woman's inheritance, in a city her family had only recently arrived in as refugees fleeing unrest in Qarawiyyin, in what is now Tunisia. She wasn't spending old, comfortable, generational wealth here either. This was fresh money, freshly inherited, spent almost immediately on a project with no guarantee it would ever be finished, let alone remembered. It's the 9th century equivalent of winning the lottery and immediately sinking every dollar of it into a public library nobody asked you to build, purely because you believed the city needed one. Sources describe her fasting throughout the construction,
a detail that tends to get repeated because it's genuinely remarkable, less a footnote and more a statement of intent. She wasn't simply funding a building from a comfortable distance. She was tying her own body, her own daily hardship, to the project's completion, as though the mosque couldn't rise unless she suffered a little alongside it. Whether that's devotion, discipline, or simply an early and extreme form of project management, the result was the same either way. A building that opened its doors in the year 859 and, remarkably, has never really closed them since. Her sister, Mariam, gets less attention in most tellings, but she was building her own mosque across town at almost exactly the same time, funded by the same inheritance, out of the same conviction that this refugee community deserved permanent places of worship and learning. Two sisters, two mosques, one shared inheritance split between them, and neither one bothering to put her own name on the front of the building in any way that outlasted the centuries quite as clearly as the institution itself did. Try naming a single modern building funded by two siblings splitting an inheritance, where both structures are still standing, still functioning, 11 centuries later. You'll be here a while. Consider, too, how little formal training either sister supposedly had for a project of this size. There were no architects to hire off a registry, no zoning department to file plans with, no contractor recommended by a neighbour who'd used him for a kitchen remodel. What existed instead was conviction, a workforce of local builders and craftsmen, and a plan carried largely in the heads of the people executing it. It is the sort of undertaking that would make a modern homeowner's renovation anxiety look almost comically small by comparison. A 2-week bathroom retile suddenly feeling a little less dramatic. What makes the story stranger still, from where you're standing now, is how little fanfare surrounded it at the time. Fatima wasn't a queen. She wasn't backed by an empire's treasury or a sultan's ambition. She was a private citizen with money and a plan, and the city simply absorbed what she built into its own bones, so thoroughly that within a few generations nobody thought to question whether a merchant's daughter really ought to have been allowed to reshape the intellectual future of an entire region. She just did it, and the city said, "Thank you," by never letting the doors close. You glance back at that plain, unassuming wall with slightly different eyes now. It isn't modest because nobody cared. It's modest because the woman who built it never asked for the credit, only for the fasting, the funding, and the quiet, permanent result. Fatima's family had arrived here as refugees from Qarawiyyin, in what is now Tunisia, settling on one bank of the river that splits the city in two. Across the water sat another wave of refugees entirely, families fleeing Cordoba in Andalusia, who built their own quarter, their own mosque, their own rival version of everything. Two riverbanks, two homesick communities, one increasingly contested bridge between them, and a friendly civic rivalry that would end up shaping the whole city for centuries. Picture the geography of it for a second, because it explains more about this city than almost anything else you'll encounter today. Fez was founded a few decades earlier by a ruler named Idris I, and expanded by his son, Idris II, who made the deliberate decision to invite these two distinct communities of refugees to settle on opposite banks of the river running through his young city. It's a bit like founding a new town and specifically recruiting two rival extended families to live on either side of Main Street, then standing back to see what happens. What happened in this case was roughly 500 years of good-natured, occasionally not so good-natured, competitive one-upmanship. The Qarawiyyin quarter, where Fatima's family settled, brought with it the traditions, scholarship, and religious practices of Ifriqiya, the old name for the region covering much of modern Tunisia. The Andalusian quarter, across the water, carried with it the refined, sophisticated culture of Córdoba, at the time one of the most advanced cities in the entire world, brimming with poetry, science, and architecture that had no real equivalent anywhere else nearby. Imagine two immigrant neighborhoods, each proudly bringing an entire civilization's worth of recipes, music, and building techniques with them, then setting up shop directly across the street from each other. Neither side was going to let the other have the nicer mosque without a fight. You can still feel the echo of that rivalry if you know where to listen for it. The call to prayer, the styles of tilework, even the particular way bread gets baked, varies subtly depending on which side of the river you're standing on. Small differences passed down through hundreds of years of two communities trying, politely but firmly, to outdo one another. It's the medieval version of two neighbouring towns bickering over whose barbecue sauce recipe is the original. Except this argument has been going on since roughly the 9th century and shows no sign of resolving anytime soon. The bridges connecting the two banks became, over time, less a formality and more a genuine civic project, an acknowledgement that a city split into two proud, competing halves eventually has to figure out how to actually function as one place. Merchants crossed daily. Marriages happened across the divide. Scholars from one quarter studied under teachers from the other, borrowing ideas the way rival neighbourhoods eventually borrow each other's best habits, whether they admit it out loud or not. And it was into this particular arrangement, on the Qarawiyyin side of that contested river, that Fatima al-Fihri decided to build something that would, eventually, outgrow the rivalry entirely and become a shared point of pride for the whole city, rather than just her own half of it. You are led toward a wooden door studded with iron nails, ordinary enough that you'd walk past it back home without a second glance, and it swings open onto something considerably less ordinary. There is no ticket booth, no velvet rope, no sign announcing that you are about to enter the oldest continuously operating educational institution on the planet. There is only a doorway, a hush, and the distinct feeling that you should probably stop talking now. You hesitate at the threshold the way you might hesitate before stepping into a library back home that's gone unusually quiet. Some instinctive social sense telling you that whatever happens beyond this point requires a different volume of voice, a different pace of footstep. The door itself is heavier than it looks, worn smooth around the handle by what you have to assume is centuries of exactly this same nervous hesitation from exactly this same kind of visitor. Somewhere deep in the wood, faint scratches and dents tell a story you'll never fully know. Deliveries, repairs, The occasional over-enthusiastic knock from a student running late to a lecture that started 600 years before your own birth. Stepping through, the noise of the street doesn't so much stop as get quietly turned down, the way a radio fades when you close a car door. The temperature shifts too, several degrees cooler almost instantly, thick stone walls doing exactly the job they were built to do long before anyone had a word for insulation. You find yourself instinctively lowering your shoulders, softening your footsteps, the universal human response to walking into somewhere that clearly matters more than you do. There's a particular kind of humility that comes from standing at a threshold like this, aware that you are, at best, a passing visitor in a story that started roughly 5 centuries before you, and, current university enrollment statistics suggest, will likely continue at least that long after you've left. It's not unlike standing at the entrance of an ancient cathedral, except here, the awe isn't aimed at any single god, so much as at the sheer, stubborn continuity of the thing. Generation after generation of scholars walking through this exact doorway to do the same basic human task of trying to learn something and pass it along. Your guide, for once, doesn't say anything either, letting the silence do whatever explaining words might otherwise attempt and fail at. Ahead of you, through a gap in the doorway, you can just make out a flash of green and white, tile catching the afternoon light in patterns too precise to have been anything other than deliberate. Somewhere beyond that, muffled but unmistakable, drifts the low, steady murmur of a lecture in progress, a rhythm of voice and response that hasn't fundamentally changed in longer than most countries have existed. You'll want to remember this door, this exact threshold, because it marks the last moment before everything you thought you understood about old buildings gets thoroughly, pleasantly rearranged. Whatever waits on the other side, it is not going to look like a museum. It is, remarkably, still very much alive. Inside, the courtyard opens up in green and white tile, laid with a precision so exact it looks drawn rather than assembled by hand, tile by tile, centuries ago. Carved cedar arches frame the space overhead, and somewhere a fountain trickles quietly enough that you have to strain to hear it over your own footsteps, which suddenly feel far too loud for a room this old. You cross it carefully, the way you'd cross a room you were fairly sure you weren't supposed to be breathing hard in. Look down at your feet for a moment, because the floor alone deserves several minutes of your attention. Every single tile beneath you was cut by hand, chiseled individually into its precise geometric shape before being fitted, piece by piece, into patterns that repeat with an almost mathematical confidence. Stars folding into hexagons, folding into stars again, an endless, hypnotic rhythm underfoot. There was no factory stamping these out in matching batches. Each piece exists because a craftsman sat with a hammer and a small chisel and decided by hand exactly where it needed to end. Above you, the cedar ceiling tells a similarly patient story, carved and painted in deep reds, greens and golds that have faded only slightly over the centuries, protected from direct sun by the very arches that hold them up. Cedar, harvested from forests in the nearby Middle Atlas Mountains, was the wood of choice for exactly this kind of work, prized for how well it resists rot and insects, a practical decision dressed up in centuries of artistry. It's the medieval equivalent of choosing a building material for its warranty, and then, almost as an afterthought, turning it into a masterpiece. The courtyard itself serves a function beyond simple beauty. Its open centre allows light and air to move through the surrounding halls, cooling the building naturally through the brutal heat of a Fez summer, long before anyone had invented air conditioning or, frankly, needed to. Stand here at midday, and you'll notice the temperature difference immediately. Shade pooling along the tiled edges, while the fountain's soft trickle adds just enough moisture to the air to make the whole space feel faintly, deliberately restful. It's less a courtyard than a very old, very elegant form of climate control, engineered by people who understood exactly how their own weather worked and built accordingly. You find yourself walking slower than you meant to, not out of exhaustion, but out of a strange, creeping reluctance to disturb anything. Somewhere off to the side, a groundskeeper sweeps a corner of tile that already looks spotless, the kind of unnecessary but deeply satisfying maintenance ritual that keeps a place like this feeling alive rather than merely preserved. He doesn't look up. You get the sense he's swept this exact corner thousands of times and will sweep it thousands more. An unremarkable act of devotion that somehow fits perfectly into a building built, in its own way, entirely out of devotion. Ahead, past the fountain, past one more set of carved doors, the murmur of voices grows slightly louder, and the unmistakable, dry, papery smell of old books begins to drift toward you. Faint at first, then entirely impossible to ignore. Beyond another set of doors sits the library itself, and it smells exactly the way a library should. Dust, old leather, and the faint mineral hush of a room that has never once stopped being taken seriously.
Shelves rise around you, holding manuscripts older than most nations currently in existence. And somewhere in here is a library card system that predates the printing press, the postage stamp, and pretty much anything you'd recognize as modern bureaucracy. Let your eyes adjust for a moment, because the light in here is deliberately dim. Small, high windows admitting just enough sun to read by, without ever exposing the collection to the kind of direct, damaging glare that would age these pages faster than a bad decade at the beach. Dust motes drift lazily through the narrow shafts of light that do make it through, catching the air the way they do in every old library you've ever stood in. Except here, the dust settling on your shoulder might reasonably be older than your own country's founding documents. The shelving itself runs in careful rows, some manuscripts stored flat, wrapped in protective cloth, others upright, spines worn soft by handling that stretches back further than you can comfortably calculate. There is, remarkably, a real system to all of it, a cataloguing and lending structure that scholars here have refined and maintained across centuries, allowing a student in this exact room to request a specific text and have it located, retrieved, and placed into their hands with a reliability that would put plenty of modern institutions to shame. Ask yourself honestly, how confident you'd feel locating a specific book in your own local library without help from a computer. Then imagine doing it here, by memory, candlelight, and careful habit, for a collection numbering in the thousands. A librarian moves quietly between the shelves, speaking to your guide in a low murmur, the universal language of people who take their work seriously enough
not to want it disturbed. He handles each volume he passes with the particular, practiced gentleness of someone who understands exactly how easily paper and parchment can be ruined by an impatient grip. You find yourself instinctively tucking your hands behind your back, the way you might in any museum. Except here, nothing is roped off. Nothing is behind glass. The whole collection simply trusted to the good sense of everyone who walks through that door. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that trust is. This isn't a sealed vault opened once a year for a documentary crew. It is, and has been for well over 1,000 years, a working library, actively used by actively enrolled students, its oldest treasures shelved not far from texts still being copied and studied today. Imagine if your hometown library still had, quietly shelved between the new releases, a handwritten original from the 9th century that patrons were simply trusted to handle with common sense. It would never happen. It happens here, every single day, and has for longer than most of the world's current borders have existed. Somewhere ahead, past a low wooden table stacked with volumes awaiting return to their shelves, sits the reason you were told to come here in the first place. A Quran older than the concept of paper itself in this part of the world. Among the collection sits a 9th century Quran written in a graceful angular script called Kufic. Its pages made from parchment rather than paper, since paper hasn't fully caught on here yet. There are volumes on medicine, astronomy and law, some bound in leather tooled by hand, all of it kept in a climate that has somehow, against every reasonable expectation, allowed ink and hide to survive well over 1,000 years without so much as a library fine. Leaning close, though not too close, and study that Kufic script for a moment. The letters are angular, almost architectural, each stroke deliberate and thick, a style of writing that predates the more flowing, cursive scripts that would later become common across the region. Reading it takes real training, even for scholars fluent in the language. The letter form's different enough from later handwriting that it functions almost like its own specialized skill, a bit like handing a modern reader a document written in careful medieval calligraphy and asking them to breeze through it over morning coffee. It simply doesn't work that way. Every page like this represents not just preserved words, but a preserved way of forming them, frozen in ink from a century most of us can barely picture clearly. The parchment itself deserves a moment of respect too, since making it was no small undertaking. Producing a single page meant preparing animal hide through a careful process of soaking, scraping, and stretching until it was thin and smooth enough to hold ink cleanly, a labour-intensive craft that made every completed page valuable well before a single word was written on it. Multiply that by the hundreds of pages needed for a single complete manuscript, and you begin to understand why books, in this era, were treated less like disposable entertainment and more like small fortunes, guarded, insured in every practical sense, and passed down with the same seriousness you might apply to a family heirloom or a modest plot of land. Elsewhere on these shelves sit texts on medicine, detailing treatments and diagnoses that would go on to influence physicians well beyond this region's borders, alongside works of astronomy charting the movement of stars with a precision that still holds up remarkably well against modern calculation. Legal texts sit nearby too, the accumulated rulings and reasoning of scholars working through questions of daily life, inheritance, and justice. Centuries of careful argument bound together in leather and quietly waiting for the next student determined enough to work through it. What keeps all of it from crumbling into dust, page by fragile page, isn't luck. It's a combination of careful stewardship, a dry climate that happens to suit old parchment far better than the humid conditions plaguing collections elsewhere in the world, and generations of caretakers who understood, long before anyone coined the term conservation science, that some things are worth protecting purely because replacing them is simply not an option. Try to imagine your own oldest family photograph surviving, untouched and legible, for 1,000 years. Now imagine an entire library of them, still being read. In a smaller side room, scribes hunch over sheets of paper produced right here in the city's own mills, a craft this region helped carry westward long before it became common elsewhere. Reed pens, dipped in ink made from soot and gum arabic, move in slow, deliberate lines, copying a text by hand because there is, quite simply, no other way yet to make a second copy of a book. Watch one of these scribes work for a few minutes, and you'll notice how little wasted motion there is. Every dip of the pen, every stroke across the page, follows a rhythm built from years, sometimes decades, of repetition. The same careful discipline you'd expect from a master calligrapher rather than a simple copyist. Mistakes here aren't corrected with a quick strike-through. An error on a page this labour-intensive to produce means starting that page over entirely, which tends to encourage a level of focused concentration that would put most modern data entry jobs to shame. There is no undo button. There is only patience, a steady hand, and an unwillingness to waste good paper. That paper, incidentally, arrived here through a fascinating chain of transmission. Paper-making techniques travelled westward along trade and scholarly routes originating in China, passing through Central Asia and the Islamic world before eventually reaching cities like Fez, which became one of the important early centres of paper production on this side of the Mediterranean, well before the craft became common in most of Europe. The mills here process fibres, typically from linen and other plant materials, pulping and pressing them into sheets in a process that would look, to modern eyes, surprisingly similar to how specialty paper gets made by hand today, just without the electricity and with considerably more physical labour involved. The ink itself is its own small feat of chemistry. Soot, carefully collected from burning oil lamps, gets mixed with gum arabic, a natural binding agent harvested from acacia trees, to produce a substance dark, stable, and durable enough to survive on a page for 1,000 years without significantly fading. There's no store to buy replacement ink from if this batch goes wrong. The scribe, or an assistant, likely mixed it themselves that same morning, adjusting the ratio by feel and experience until the consistency was exactly right, a bit like a chef adjusting a family recipe by taste rather than measurement. Except here, the stakes involve legibility across the next several centuries rather than tonight's dinner. Nearby, sheets already finished are left to dry flat under light weights, since curling parchment or paper is its own quiet enemy of legibility down the line. A junior scribe, likely an apprentice still years away from copying anything of real importance, spends his afternoon trimming edges and ruling faint guidelines onto blank sheets with a stylus, preparing the next batch for a more senior hand. It's the medieval equivalent of an intern formatting spreadsheets, except the spreadsheet in question might still be legible a millennium from now. Consider for a moment how many hours went into the manuscript you saw on the shelf just moments ago. Every single page required this exact process, repeated patiently, letter by careful letter, until an entire book existed where none had before. There was no printing press waiting in the wings to speed things along, no way to simply run off additional copies once the first one was finished. Every single volume in this library exists because someone, somewhere, sat exactly where this scribe is sitting now and refused to rush. Keeping paper and parchment alive for centuries in a climate this dry and dusty takes more than good intentions, and the library's caretakers have built their storage rooms with thick walls, small high windows, and careful ventilation designed to keep temperature and moisture from ever swinging too far in either direction. It is, in effect, a climate control system built entirely out of stone, geometry, and a great deal of stubborn patience, centuries before anyone invented the word humidity. Notice, if you can, how deliberately those windows are positioned, set high enough to admit air and a modest amount of light, without ever allowing direct sun to fall across the shelves below. Sunlight, as it turns out, is one of the fastest ways to destroy old paper and ink, bleaching colour and weakening fibre with a patience of its own, quietly working over years until a once legible page fades into an illegible smear. The builders of this room clearly understood that threat long before anyone had a scientific vocabulary for ultraviolet damage, and they solved it the same way they solved most problems here, through careful architecture rather than complicated machinery. The walls themselves, thick stone and packed earth, function as a kind of passive insulation, keeping the interior temperature remarkably stable regardless of what's happening outside. Step in here during the brutal heat of a Fez afternoon, and you'll feel an immediate, noticeable coolness, several degrees at least, the same natural cooling effect you'd notice walking into a stone cellar back home. That stability matters enormously for anything made of organic material, since dramatic swings between hot and cold, or wet and dry, are precisely what cause parchment to crack, paper to warp, and leather bindings to eventually crumble into something resembling old cracker crumbs. Ventilation, too, gets careful attention. Small gaps and openings positioned to allow a gentle, continuous flow of air through the storage spaces without ever letting in enough moisture to invite mold or insects, two of the most persistent enemies any old book collection will ever face. It's a delicate balance. Air moving just enough to prevent stagnation, but not so much that it introduces the kind of environmental swings that damage fragile materials. Modern museum conservators, working with electronic humidity sensors and climate-controlled display cases, are essentially trying to recreate, with considerably more expensive equipment, exactly what this building achieved centuries ago using nothing but thoughtful stonework and an understanding of how air naturally wants to move. There is, on top of all this passive engineering, a genuine human element too. Caretakers who inspect the shelves regularly, checking for the telltale signs of insect damage or dampness, moving a volume to a drier shelf if a particular corner of the room ever starts behaving suspiciously. It is unglamorous, repetitive work, the kind that produces no dramatic before and after photographs. Only the quiet, cumulative fact that a manuscript checked on today looks exactly as it did a decade ago, and likely will a decade from now. There's something almost comically humbling about it, honestly. Somewhere in a modern museum right now, a team of specialists is fussing over a single manuscript with instruments that cost more than most people's cars, while here, an entire library's worth of comparably ancient material has been quietly, successfully preserved, using techniques that amount to building a good wall in the right place and leaving a small hole for air to pass through. Sometimes, the simplest solution really is the one that survives 1,000 years. Try telling that to anyone who's ever bought an overpriced dehumidifier. Beyond these storage rooms, back out toward the courtyard, the sound of an actual lecture in progress finally becomes impossible to ignore. Back out in the courtyard, students sit cross-legged in loose circles around a scholar working through questions of theology, law, or astronomy. None of it delivered from a lectern, all of it delivered from memory and conviction. There are no desks, no diplomas handed across a stage, only years of recitation and debate that will eventually, quietly, earn a student the right to sit at the centre of a circle of his own. You settle in near the edge of one such circle, close enough to hear, careful not to intrude, and watch the rhythm of it unfold. The scholar at the centre speaks in long, measured sentences, occasionally pausing to let a student respond, challenge a point, or ask for clarification. The whole exchange feeling less like a modern classroom lecture and more like an ongoing, structured conversation that's been running, in one form or another, for longer than anyone present can remember. There's no textbook being passed around. Memory, and the careful oral transmission of memory, functions as the primary technology here, students committing enormous volumes of text and reasoning to mind through repetition, recitation, and sheer disciplined effort. Try for a moment to remember the last time you memorized anything longer than a phone number. These students are expected to hold entire legal frameworks, theological arguments, and scientific principles in memory well enough to debate them on the spot, without notes, without a search engine quietly waiting in their pocket to bail them out. It's the intellectual equivalent of running a marathon while everyone else around you is coasting on an electric scooter. Except here, the marathon has been going on, in some form, for over 1,000 years, and nobody's invented the scooter yet. Progress through this system isn't measured in semesters or credit hours. A student advances by demonstrating mastery, through recitation, through debate, through the accumulated judgment of teachers who have watched them work through difficult questions over months and years. There's no diploma ceremony, no cap tossed triumphantly into the air. Recognition arrives gradually, almost informally, as a student's opinions begin to carry weight in these circles, as younger students begin directing their own questions toward them, rather than only toward the scholar at the centre. It is, in its own quiet way, a credentialing system, built entirely on demonstrated competence rather than paperwork, which sounds almost quaint, until you remember how much of the modern world still runs on exactly the opposite principle. The subjects covered range widely, from close readings of religious and legal texts to increasingly sophisticated discussions of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. Disciplines that don't stay neatly separated the way they might in a modern university course catalogue. A scholar deeply trained in law might just as easily field a question about the movement of celestial bodies, since the boundaries between fields of study here are considerably blurrier and considerably more interesting than the rigid departmental walls you might be used to. You linger a while longer, watching one student press a particularly sharp question toward the scholar at the centre, watching the scholar pause, genuinely consider it, and respond with the careful patience of someone who has clearly fielded difficult questions for decades. Somewhere beyond this circle, word of exactly this kind of intellectual rigour has travelled considerably further than the walls of this courtyard, drawing scholars from across an entire sea to come study here themselves. Word of this place travelled far beyond the city walls, drawing scholars and physicians from across the Mediterranean world to study or argue in its courtyard. Among them, a young historian named Ibn Khaldun, pulled into the orbit of the Marinid court here before going on to write some of the most influential history ever composed. Fez, it turns out, has always had a habit of quietly producing people the rest of the world eventually has to reckon with. Picture the sheer distance some of these scholars travelled to end up standing exactly where you're standing now. Long journeys by land and sea, weeks or months of travel through unpredictable weather and uncertain roads, undertaken entirely on the strength of a reputation, word passed from traveller to traveller that this particular courtyard held teachers worth the trouble of reaching. There was no way to verify any of it in advance, no reviews to check, no way of knowing for certain that the journey would be worth it until you'd already committed weeks of your life and a significant portion of your savings to the attempt. It's the medieval equivalent of booking a semester abroad based entirely on a rumour you heard from a merchant passing through town, then discovering, against reasonable odds, that the rumour was entirely true. Ibn Khaldun's connection to this city runs deeper than a single visit. Born in Tunis, he moved through several courts across North Africa over the course of his career, serving at various points as an advisor, diplomat, and scholar, with Fez and its intellectual circles forming an important part of that trajectory. It was this kind of environment, rich with debate, texts, and rigorous argument, that helped shape the thinking behind his later masterwork, a sweeping study of history and society that scholars still study today for its remarkably early insights into how civilizations rise, function, and eventually decline. Imagine one of the most important historians in human history casually crediting part of his intellectual formation to time spent arguing in the exact courtyard you walked through 20 minutes ago. Physicians came too, drawn by the medical texts held in this very library, some of them going on to develop their own influential treatises after years spent studying and debating here. The flow of knowledge wasn't one-directional either.
Scholars arriving from Andalusia brought with them ideas and texts from Córdoba's own remarkable intellectual tradition, while others travelled onward from Fez to cities further east, carrying local scholarship with them in turn. Ideas moved along these routes the way goods moved along trade caravans, passed from hand to hand, city to city, each stop adding its own refinements before sending the whole collection onward. You try to imagine the accents that must have filled this courtyard over the centuries, dialects from across an enormous stretch of the known world, all attempting to work through the exact same difficult questions in whatever version of scholarly language they'd each been trained in. It's the sort of intellectual melting pot that modern universities spend enormous marketing budgets trying to claim credit for. Achieved here, centuries earlier, without a single admissions brochure. Somewhere nearby, the buildings constructed to house these travelling students still stand, elaborately decorated proof of just how seriously this city took the business of keeping its scholars fed, sheltered, and reasonably well rested. Since the mosque itself offers no dormitories, the Sultan has scattered madrasas throughout the city, ornate residential schools where students from distant towns can sleep, study, and argue about their lecture notes late into the night, before crossing town each morning to sit back in that same courtyard. Some of these buildings are, frankly, more beautifully decorated than most palaces you will ever set foot in, which tells you exactly how seriously this city takes the business of education. Step inside one of these madrasas, and the first thing that strikes you is the sheer density of decoration packed into a relatively modest footprint. Carved plaster covers entire walls in patterns so fine they look almost embroidered rather than built. Geometric designs flowing seamlessly into elegant calligraphy. Verses and inscriptions worked directly into the architecture itself. Zellige tilework climbs the lower walls in its familiar, dazzling geometry, while carved cedar, much like what you saw back in the mosque's own courtyard, frames doorways and upper galleries in warm, dark wood that's aged into a deep, rich patina over the centuries. It's the kind of ornamentation you'd expect reserved for royalty, lavished instead on a building whose primary function is housing broke students who are, in every practical sense, living on borrowed time and someone else's charity. The living arrangements themselves are modest by comparison to all that decoration. Small individual cells arranged around a central courtyard, each one barely large enough for a sleeping mat, a small shelf for books, and whatever personal belongings a student managed to carry from home. Picture the tiniest dorm room you ever lived in during your own education. Then imagine it carved from stone, several stories up, with a view down into one of the most beautifully tiled courtyards you'll ever see, and absolutely no elevator to help you haul your belongings up there. Students here weren't chasing comfort. They were chasing an education, and the Sultan, to his considerable credit, seemed to understand that the comfort could wait, as long as the walls surrounding that modest bedroom reminded a young scholar, every single day,
that someone powerful believed his education mattered enough to fund something this beautiful around it. That funding came directly from the ruling Marinid dynasty, who saw considerable political and religious value in supporting scholarship, positioning themselves as patrons of learning in a way that reinforced their own legitimacy while genuinely expanding access to education for students who otherwise couldn't have afforded to travel here, let alone stay for the years required to complete their studies. It's an arrangement not unlike a modern government funding public universities, except with considerably more hand-carved plasterwork and noticeably fewer parking disputes. The rhythm of daily life inside one of these buildings settles quickly into something recognizable as any student's routine, regardless of century. Mornings begin with prayers and a modest breakfast, followed by the walk across town to the mosque's courtyard for the day's lecture circles. Afternoons are given over to memorization, private study, and the low murmur of roommates quizzing each other on points of law or grammar late into the evening, long after any sensible person would have already gone to sleep. It is, in every meaningful sense, a dormitory experience, minus the vending machines and plus rather a lot more carved cedar. Each evening, as lectures wind down in the mosque's courtyard, you can watch small clusters of students making their way back through the darkening streets toward whichever madrasa currently houses them, voices still tangled in whatever argument occupied the day's lesson, footsteps echoing off walls that have absorbed this exact same nightly ritual for hundreds of years running. Somewhere down one of these streets sits a much stranger monument to this city's obsession with precision and time, a mechanism nobody quite remembers how to explain. Down the street sits a strange, unassuming wall studded with 13 small windows and brass bowls, a water clock built to mark the hours and signal prayer times for the Sultan's newest madrasa. Nobody currently alive, including the scholars who study it most closely, can fully agree on how its original mechanism worked, which means you are looking at a machine that has successfully out-mysteried its own inventors. Stand in front of it for a while, and you'll understand the confusion immediately. 13 small wooden platforms, each holding a brass bowl, line the wall in a neat row, positioned above a series of small windows and doors that would once have opened and closed on a schedule, marking the passage of the hours for a city that needed reliable timekeeping to coordinate 5 daily prayers with precision. The visible mechanism today is largely decorative at this point. Its original inner workings, the gears, weights, and water channels that actually drove the thing, having faded into a combination of historical record and educated guesswork over the centuries. What we do know is that it relied on the steady, predictable flow of water, likely dripping or draining at a carefully calibrated rate, to move some kind of internal mechanism that, in turn, triggered the opening of doors or the ringing of a signal at fixed intervals through the day and night. Water clocks of this general type existed across the Islamic world during this era, some remarkably sophisticated, incorporating complex systems of floats, counterweights, and gears to achieve a level of mechanical precision that wouldn't look out of place in a much later era of clockwork engineering. This particular one was built specifically to serve the Sultan's madrasa nearby, ensuring that students and instructors could rely on consistent timing for prayer without needing to constantly interpret the position of the sun. Locals passing by Treat it today with a kind of easy, familiar affection. The way you might treat a strange, slightly unreliable landmark in your own hometown that everyone has stopped questioning simply because it's always been there.
Children point at the small windows and invent their own explanations for how it once worked. Theories considerably more imaginative and no less plausible than some of the ones proposed by professional historians over the years. Here's the genuinely funny part, though. Despite centuries of study, despite historians and engineers picking apart every visible clue the structure offers, nobody has fully reconstructed exactly how the original internal mechanism operated. Records describing its construction exist, but translating those records into a complete, working understanding of the actual gears and mechanisms involved has proven stubbornly difficult, the details having been either lost, ambiguously recorded, or simply too specialized for later generations to fully reverse engineer. It's the medieval equivalent of finding an old appliance in your grandparents' attic, understanding vaguely what it must have done, and having absolutely no idea how it actually worked. Except in this case, the appliance is 600 years old, and several genuinely qualified historians have spent careers trying to crack it. You find something oddly comforting in that persistent mystery, honestly. In a city that has spent centuries carefully preserving, cataloguing, and explaining nearly everything within its walls, it's almost reassuring to find one stubborn exception, a machine that built its own permanent puzzle directly into the architecture, and has successfully kept the answer to itself for 600 years running. Somewhere nearby, the mosque it once served fills, every single Friday, with a crowd considerably easier to explain. On Friday, the mosque fills to a capacity that makes your earlier crowded alleyway feel like an empty parking lot. Rows of worshippers spilling out past the courtyard and into the surrounding streets as the call to midday prayer settles over the entire city at once. For a few minutes, the hammering, haggling, and general commotion of Fez goes almost quiet. You arrive early enough to watch the space transform. Rows of prayer mats unrolled with practiced efficiency across the courtyard's tile, then extending further still, spilling out through doorways and into the narrow streets beyond, as the crowd grows well past what the building's interior alone could ever comfortably hold. Men remove their shoes at the threshold, tucking them into whatever gap or shelf happens to be nearest. A small, ordinary ritual repeated thousands of times in the space of a single hour, somehow never once descending into the chaos you might expect from thousands of shoes changing hands in close quarters. There is an order to this crowd that took you completely by surprise back at that first gate, and here it finally reveals itself in full, quiet, practiced, and remarkably calm given the sheer number of people involved. The call to prayer itself rolls out over the rooftops from the minaret, a long, rising and falling vocal pattern that carries considerably further than you'd expect from an unamplified human voice, echoing off the tight stone walls of the Medina in a way that seems to reach every corner of the city, more or less simultaneously. For a few minutes, genuinely, the noise of Fez, the hammering, the haggling, the donkeys, the endless human commotion that's followed you since you first stepped through that gate, quiets to something approaching stillness. It's the only moment all day the city seems to collectively agree on anything,
and it happens like clockwork, 5 times daily. This particular gathering simply being the largest and most crowded of the week.
Inside, the sermon that follows touches on matters of faith, community, and daily conduct, delivered from a raised pulpit to a congregation stretching further than the speaker's voice alone could carry, requiring, in earlier centuries, a relay of repeaters positioned through the crowd to pass the words along accurately to those standing furthest back. A remarkably early and entirely human solution to a problem modern sound systems solve with a single microphone. Imagine attending a lecture so large that the message needs to be manually repeated, person to person, until it reaches the back row, and somehow trusting that the message arrives largely intact by the time it does. Once the prayer concludes, the transformation reverses almost as quickly as it began. Mats get rolled and stacked. Shoes get reclaimed, occasionally after a moment of good-natured confusion when 2 nearly identical pairs turn up beside each other. The crowd disperses back out into the surrounding alleys, and within 20 minutes, the hammering, the haggling, and the donkeys have all reasserted themselves entirely, the city's usual noise flooding back in like water rushing to fill a space briefly, deliberately held empty. You step back out into that noise yourself and immediately, thoroughly, remember exactly why you got lost on the way in here in the first place. Stepping back out into the Medina, you realize the gate you entered through has already vanished into a tangle of alleys so similar you could swear you've passed the same spice stall 4 times, mostly because you have. The Medina holds somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,000 streets and lanes, most of them narrower than your outstretched arms, and locals glide through it without a second thought while you begin quietly accepting your fate as a lost person. Take a moment to appreciate the genuine engineering behind this confusion, because it isn't simple carelessness. Fez el-Bali developed organically over centuries, rather than according to any single planned grid. Streets growing and branching the way tree roots do, following the practical logic of where buildings, workshops, and family compounds happened to already exist, rather than any tidy urban planner's straight line. Some of this tangled layout served genuinely defensive purposes too, narrow, winding streets, making it considerably harder for any invading force to move quickly or navigate confidently through the city, turning the entire Medina into something of a built-in maze that favored residents over outsiders, in exactly the kind of situation you'd rather not personally experience. You pass the same brass lamp seller for what you're fairly certain is the 3rd time, his stall unmistakable thanks to the elaborate hanging lanterns crowding every available inch of space above his head, casting intricate shadow patterns across the cobblestones below, even in broad daylight. He recognizes you this time and offers a small, knowing smile, the universal expression of someone who has watched exactly this scenario play out with exactly this kind of visitor more times than he could possibly count. There's no malice in it, just the quiet amusement of a man who could navigate this entire Medina blindfolded, watching someone struggle with a task that stopped being difficult for him decades ago. The alleys themselves shift dramatically in width and character within just a few steps, opening briefly into a small, sunlit square crowded with a cluster of stalls, before narrowing again into a shadowed passage, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass without one of you turning sideways. Overhead, in some stretches, wooden beams and woven reed screens stretch across the gap between buildings, filtering the harsh midday sun into something softer, dappled,
and considerably more forgiving on your already overwhelmed senses. It's a bit like walking through a labyrinth designed by someone who genuinely cared whether you got a decent tan along the way, alternating shade and sun with what feels almost like architectural courtesy. Try for a moment imagining your own hometown's street layout evolving this way. No zoning board, no city planner, just centuries of individual families and merchants building exactly where it made sense at the time. The resulting tangle inherited by every generation since, without anyone ever seriously attempting to straighten it out. It would never survive a modern permitting process. Here, it's simply called home, and the roughly 90,000 people who live within these walls navigate it daily with the same unthinking ease you'd apply to finding your own kitchen in the dark. You give up trying to retrace your steps with any real confidence, and instead let your ears take over, following the growing rhythm of hammered metal drifting from somewhere just ahead. Before you fully register any of it visually, Fez arrives in your ears, layer upon layer of sound stacking into something that never quite qualifies as noise, and never quite qualifies as music either. Coppersmiths hammer a steady metallic pulse from somewhere to your left. A donkey brays its objection to absolutely everything, and there isn't a single engine anywhere in this entire walled city, which is the sort of detail you don't appreciate until you notice it. Stand still for just a moment and try to isolate each individual sound layered into this particular soundscape. Beneath the coppersmith's rhythmic hammering runs a steadier, quieter percussion, sandals and bare feet against worn stone, thousands of individual footsteps blending into a low, constant shuffle that never fully stops from dawn until well after dark. Somewhere above that, voices rise and fall in overlapping conversation. Arabic mixed with the Berber dialects spoken by communities from the surrounding mountains and countryside. Merchants calling out prices, neighbours exchanging news, children shouting the particular, universal shriek of children anywhere who have just discovered a new game. The complete absence of engine noise takes real, deliberate effort to notice, mostly because your own ears have spent an entire lifetime tuning out exactly that sound as background static, the constant hum of cars, buses and machinery that fills every modern city you've ever lived in or visited. Here, there is none of it. Not because the city banned vehicles as some kind of quaint tourist attraction, but because the streets themselves, most of them barely wider than a loaded mule, were never physically built to accommodate anything larger. Every single good that moves through this medina, produce, textiles, furniture, building materials, moves either on someone's back, on a mule's, or on a small handcart, pushed and pulled entirely by human effort. Try for a second calculating how many delivery trucks worth of goods pass through your own city each day. Then imagine every single one of those deliveries instead arriving strapped to the back of a patient, mildly resentful animal. The mules themselves deserve particular respect here, since they function as this city's entire freight industry, hauling everything from sacks of grain to bundles of raw hide to, on one memorable occasion you've already witnessed today, an entire dismantled loom balanced precariously across one animal's back. Their hooves add their own distinct percussion to the overall soundscape, a sharp, irregular clatter against stone that somehow never fully blends into the background, no matter how many times you hear it pass. Underneath all of it runs the steady, rhythmic hammering from the metalworkers' quarter, coppersmiths and blacksmiths shaping trays, lanterns and tools with hand tools alone. Each strike ringing out with a bright, metallic clarity that carries surprisingly far through these narrow stone corridors. It's the closest thing this city has to a constant, ambient drumbeat. A sound so consistent that long-time residents likely stopped hearing it as noise decades ago, the same way you eventually stop noticing your own refrigerator humming in the next room. You find yourself oddly grateful for all of it by the time exhaustion finally catches up with you. This strange, layered symphony of human and animal effort, somehow more soothing than the mechanical drone you're used to falling asleep to back home. Which is fortunate, because it's about time you found somewhere to actually rest for the night. Exhausted and thoroughly turned around, you are eventually steered toward a fondouk, a merchant's inn built around a quiet courtyard where travellers sleep upstairs and their goods, and occasionally their camels, are stored below. It is part hotel, part warehouse, part impromptu trading floor, and entirely unlike anywhere you have ever paid to spend the night. The building itself opens around a modest central courtyard, considerably plainer than the mosque's elaborate tilework, but still functional in exactly the same way, allowing air and light to circulate through the surrounding rooms, while keeping the whole structure naturally cool. Ground floor arches ring the courtyard, each one opening into a storage bay currently occupied by sacks of grain, bundled textiles, and, in one corner, a small collection of genuinely unbothered camels, chewing thoughtfully on something you'd rather not investigate too closely. Above, a narrow wooden staircase leads up to a gallery of small guest rooms, little more than a sleeping mat and a shuttered window, offered to travellers passing through for trade, pilgrimage, or study. Exactly the sort of purpose that's brought you here yourself. There's an entire, unspoken economy running through this courtyard that you slowly start to piece together as evening settles in. A merchant negotiates loudly over the price of storing his goods overnight, while his mule stands nearby, entirely uninterested in the outcome. Another traveller, clearly a regular, exchanges a friendly nod with the innkeeper before heading straight up to a room he's apparently occupied dozens of times before. Fondouks like this one function across the Medina as a kind of combined hotel, warehouse, and informal trading post, allowing merchants to secure their goods overnight, rest safely, and make useful connections with other traders passing through, all under one roof, all for a modest fee. Compare this for a moment to your own experience of a modern hotel, where your room and your luggage generally exist within a few feet of each other, but nobody's expecting you to also negotiate a wholesale grain deal in the lobby before bed. Here, commerce and rest are thoroughly intertwined, the same building serving as both your bedroom and, quite literally, your goods' overnight parking garage. It's an efficient system, honestly, born from centuries of merchants needing exactly this combination of services in cities where trade and travel were inseparable from one another. Your own room, when you finally reach it, offers little beyond the basics: a thin mat, a small window shuttered against the evening chill, and walls thick enough to muffle most of the courtyard's continuing activity below. It is not, by any modern standard, luxurious. But it is quiet, relatively speaking, and after a day spent lost in alleyways, scrubbed raw in a bathhouse you haven't even reached yet, and thoroughly overwhelmed by more sensory information than your nervous system was built to process in a single afternoon, it feels, remarkably, like exactly enough. You settle onto the mat, listening to the muffled murmur of merchants below, finishing their business for the night, and think, not for the first time today, that this city has an entire invisible system for absolutely everything. Once you catch your breath, you notice the Medina isn't just a maze, it's a filing system, with each trade claiming its own street, its own smell, its own particular din. Turn one corner and you're surrounded by dyers with forearms stained a permanent shade of indigo. Turn another and you're knee-deep in the sweet, sawdusty perfume of a woodworker's row. This organisation isn't accidental, and it isn't recent either. Trades across the Medina have historically clustered by neighbourhood, guild-like arrangements grouping metalworkers near metalworkers, textile dyers near textile dyers, each craft benefiting from proximity to its fellow practitioners, shared suppliers, shared customers, and the kind of accumulated expertise that comes from an entire street's worth of competitors, quietly, constantly comparing techniques. It's not unlike how certain modern cities develop a garment district or a jewellery quarter, entire blocks organising themselves around a single industry until the neighbourhood's identity becomes inseparable from whatever's being made there. Walk the woodworker's row for a few minutes, and the sensory experience is almost meditative. Sawdust drifting through shafts of afternoon light, the rhythmic scrape of hand planes shaping cedar and walnut into furniture, doors, and the elaborately carved architectural details you admired earlier back at the madrasa. Craftsmen here train through years of apprenticeship, often within family workshops passed down across generations. A young boy sweeping sawdust today, likely to be shaping his own furniture from this exact bench in 20 years' time. There's a patience to the whole trade that feels almost foreign to modern eyes, no power tools accelerating the process, just steady hands, sharp blades, and an apprenticeship system measured in years rather than a quick online certification course. A few streets over, the metalworkers' quarter announces itself with sound well before sight, hammers striking brass and copper into trays, lanterns and cooking vessels, sparks occasionally flying from a forge tucked into the back of a particularly cramped workshop. The finished pieces hang in dazzling rows outside each stall, catching the light in a way that makes the entire street glitter faintly, even under the Medina's already inconsistent daylight. You'd be forgiven for assuming an entire street's worth of identical, glittering brass trays represents some kind of mass production. But each piece here was hammered, etched, and polished individually by hand, meaning no two are ever truly identical, however similar they might look from a passing glance. Textile workers occupy their own dedicated stretch too, looms clacking steadily behind open doorways, wool and cotton dyed in vivid colours drying overhead on lines strung between buildings, the fabric fluttering gently like flags belonging to no particular nation. The specialisation runs deep enough that entire families have built generational reputations around a single, narrow skill. A particular style of embroidery, a specific dye technique, Expertise so refined and specific that customers travel considerable distances specifically seeking out one family's particular workshop, rather than any of a dozen seemingly similar alternatives nearby. It's an economy built almost entirely on reputation, proximity, and generations of accumulated skill, remarkably resilient against the kind of anonymous mass production that would eventually reshape manufacturing everywhere else. Nothing prepares you for the most intense of these craft quarters, though, the one that announces itself from 2 full streets away, well before you ever catch sight of it. Nothing, however, prepares you for the tannery. You smell it roughly 2 streets before you see it, a thick, unapologetic wall of odour that a passing shopkeeper anticipates by handing you a sprig of fresh mint before you've even asked. Below you, stone vats arranged like a monumental painter's palette hold dye in saffron yellow, poppy red, and deep indigo blue, with men working hides by hand the same way their fathers and grandfathers did. Climb the narrow stairs up to one of the leather shop terraces overlooking the tannery, mint pressed firmly against your nose, and the view that opens up below is genuinely striking. Dozens of round stone vats clustered together in tight rows, each one filled with a different substance. Some for softening raw hides, others holding the vivid natural dyes that give this place its reputation. Workers move between the vats, knee-deep in liquid, hauling hides from one stage of the process to the next, with a rhythm that suggests decades of practiced, physically demanding routine, muscles built entirely through repetition rather than any gym membership. The smell, once you push past that first overwhelming wave, breaks down into distinct, individually unpleasant components. Raw hides arrive here, caked in the remnants of the animal they once belonged to, requiring a soaking process involving cow urine, pigeon droppings, and quicklime to loosen hair and soften the material before dyeing can even begin. Pigeon droppings, specifically, contain enzymes that help break down the hide's stiffer fibres, a genuinely effective, entirely natural treatment that also happens to be one of the primary reasons you're currently pressing mint leaves against your face like your life depends on it. It's the medieval equivalent of a leather conditioning treatment, remarkably effective, spectacularly unpleasant to stand anywhere near. Once softened, hides move into the dye vats themselves. Colours derived entirely from natural sources, poppy flowers producing that vivid red, indigo plants yielding deep blue, saffron threads creating the warm yellow that gives the whole tannery its postcard-famous appearance. Workers wade directly into these vats, treading and turning the hides by hand to ensure even colour absorption, a process requiring both physical strength and an eye for exactly when a hide has reached the right shade. No chemical timer or digital readout involved, just decades of accumulated instinct passed down through family workshops that have operated in this exact spot for generations. This craft dates back centuries here, Fez having built genuine renown across the wider region for the quality and durability of its leather goods, exported along trade routes stretching well beyond Morocco's own borders. Ask yourself honestly whether you'd trade your own office job for a career spent knee-deep in a dye vat that smells this genuinely unforgettable. however striking the final leather product might turn out. Most modern job postings, you'll notice, tend to leave that particular detail out of the description entirely. You finally step back down from the terrace, mint leaves thoroughly crushed and entirely spent, deeply impressed by the craftsmanship and profoundly grateful that your own evening plans involve absolutely no further vats of any kind. Ahead, mercifully, waits a smell considerably easier to love. Hunger eventually wins, and you follow your nose towards something considerably more pleasant, the scent of bread rising from a communal oven tucked into a side street. Most homes here have no oven of their own, so the women of the neighbourhood shape their dough at home and carry it to the local forain, where the baker slides it into the fire and somehow, without ever writing anything down, remembers precisely whose loaf belongs to whom. Step inside and the heat hits you immediately, radiating off a large wood-fired oven tended by a baker who moves with the unhurried confidence of someone who has managed this exact fire for decades. Loaves arrive throughout the morning and afternoon in a steady procession, each one carried on a flat wooden board balanced against a hip, shaped and marked at home by a family member before making the short trip to this communal fire. Some loaves arrive round, others oblong, some bearing a small decorative pattern pressed into the top, a personal signature of sorts that, combined with the baker's own memory, ensures nobody's dinner accidentally goes home with the wrong household. This shared baking arrangement makes considerable practical sense once you think it through. Building and maintaining an individual oven inside every single home would demand fuel, space, and constant tending that most households simply can't spare, particularly in a densely packed Medina, where space itself is the scarcest resource of all. A single communal oven, tended by one dedicated baker, serves an entire neighbourhood far more efficiently. The fire kept burning steadily throughout the day, rather than lit and relit dozens of times across dozens of separate kitchens. It's not unlike a modern apartment building sharing a single laundry room, rather than every unit installing its own washer and dryer. Except here, the stakes involve dinner rather than clean socks, and the baker functions as a genuinely trusted neighbourhood institution, rather than a coin-operated machine down in the basement. The bread itself, once it emerges, is dense, slightly chewy, with a thick, satisfying crust developed from the intense, even heat of a proper wood fire. A texture that no home oven back where you come from could realistically replicate. You watch as a young girl arrives to collect her family's loaves, the baker handing them over without a moment's hesitation, despite the dozens of nearly identical loaves currently crowding his counter. And you find yourself genuinely impressed by a memory system running entirely on faces, patterns, and years of accumulated familiarity. No ticket number, no claim slip, just trust and a very good memory. You're handed a warm loaf of your own eventually, torn open to release a cloud of steam and that unmistakable, deeply satisfying smell of fresh bread, still faintly smoky from the fire. It is, without exaggeration, one of the best things you've eaten in longer than you can remember, made considerably better by the fact that you watched the entire process unfold, from raw dough to finished loaf. No supermarket bakery aisle involved anywhere along the way. All that remains now is something to wash it down with, and in this city, there is only ever one correct answer to that particular question. No transaction in Fez, however small, happens without tea. A merchant pours it from an absurd height into a small glass, producing a thin froth on top that apparently signals proper technique, then hands it to you, already sweetened well beyond what your dentist would ever approve. You will drink at least 4 glasses today. You did not plan for this. Nobody ever plans for this. Watch the pouring itself closely, because it is, without question, a genuine performance rather than mere function. The merchant lifts the ornate metal teapot high above the small, delicate glass below, sometimes a full arm's length up, and pours in a thin, unbroken stream that somehow, despite the distance and the apparent recklessness of the whole maneuver, never once misses its target. The height serves an actual purpose beyond showmanship, aerating the tea as it falls to produce that characteristic thin layer of foam across the top, a visual signal of proper preparation that locals apparently judge with the same seriousness a coffee connoisseur back home might apply to latte art. The tea itself combines green tea leaves, generally imported from China, along trade routes that have connected this region to the wider world for centuries, with a generous handful of fresh spearmint and an amount of sugar that would make a modern nutritionist quietly excuse themselves from the room. This isn't a light, delicately sweetened afternoon refreshment. It's closer to drinking dessert, the sugar cut, chipped from a solid cone using a small hammer before this ritual ever began, added in quantities that assume you'll be needing the energy for whatever comes next, and in a city this physically demanding to navigate, you generally will. Refusing a glass, incidentally, simply isn't an option that exists within polite local custom. Tea here functions as the universal gesture of hospitality, offered before, during, and after any conversation of substance, business negotiations, casual greetings between neighbours, or the simple act of a merchant deciding he'd like 15 minutes of your company before discussing the price of his goods. Turning down that offer would land somewhere between mildly confusing and genuinely rude, a bit like declining to shake someone's outstretched hand back home. Technically you're right, but guaranteed to create a small, awkward ripple in whatever social moment you're currently standing inside. There's a rhythm to the whole ritual too, one that plays out identically whether you're in a merchant's stall or a private home. The glass is small, rarely more than a few careful sips, but it gets refilled without asking, the pour repeated, the same tall, deliberate stream arcing down again the moment your glass shows any sign of emptiness. Nobody counts how many rounds you've had. Somebody simply keeps pouring, the way a good host anywhere keeps topping up a glass long after you've stopped tracking the total yourself. By your 4th glass of the day, you've developed a genuinely different relationship with sugar than you walked into this city with this morning, your body apparently adjusting, with remarkable speed, to a beverage that functions as roughly 1 part tea and 2 parts dessert. You've also, without quite noticing it happen, ended up in 3 separate lengthy conversations with merchants who had absolutely no obligation to befriend you, each one initiated over exactly this small glass of impossibly sweet tea. It's remarkably effective social lubricant, honestly, considerably more pleasant than anything involving a business card. And considering the day you've had so far, dusty, dye-stained, thoroughly exhausted, there is genuinely no better moment to be steered toward a proper bath. Covered in dust, dye fumes, and the general grime of a day in the Medina, you are pointed toward the hammam, the public bathhouse, where the concept of personal modesty quietly excuses itself from the room. You are handed a black soap that smells faintly of olives, then scrubbed by a stranger using a coarse mitt with an enthusiasm that borders on personal vengeance. The hammam itself unfolds across a series of connected rooms, each one progressively hotter than the last, moving you gradually from a mild, comfortable warmth toward a chamber so thick with steam that visibility drops to a few feet in any direction. This graduated heating serves a genuine physiological purpose, gently opening pores and loosening grime before any real scrubbing begins, a system considerably more thoughtful than simply blasting you with the hottest available water the moment you walk through the door. You move between these rooms at your own pace, sweat beading immediately, the thick, humid air settling into your lungs with every breath. An entirely different sensory experience from any shower you've ever rushed through back home. The black soap, called Beldi soap locally, is made from olive oil and olive paste, worked into a thick, almost gel-like consistency, entirely unlike the hard, foaming bars you're used to.
It gets massaged directly onto your skin and left to sit for several long minutes, softening whatever accumulated grime the day has left behind, before the real work begins. That real work arrives in the form of a coarse, exfoliating mitt, wielded by an attendant whose enthusiasm for scrubbing dead skin off a total stranger's back would concern you deeply in almost any other context. It is not gentle. It is not meant to be gentle. Within minutes, small, alarming rolls of exfoliated skin begin appearing on your arms and shoulders, evidence of grime you genuinely did not realize you'd been carrying around, quite possibly for weeks. There's a particular kind of vulnerability in surrendering your personal space this completely to a stranger, an intimacy your own culture back home reserves at most for a dermatologist's office, and even then behind a firmly closed door. Here it's simply Tuesday, a routine weekly ritual for locals who arrive not just to get clean, but to socialize, catch up on neighborhood news, and relax in a way that treats bathing as a genuinely communal event rather than the solitary rushed 5 minutes you typically allot it before racing out the door each morning. By the time you finally emerge, pink, thoroughly scrubbed, and several layers of skin lighter than when you arrived, you feel a kind of cleanliness that no shower back home has ever quite achieved, a deep, almost aggressive freshness that leaves you both relieved it's over and, somewhat to your own surprise, genuinely grateful for the experience. You step back out into the cooler evening air, feeling lighter in every sense of the word, immediately followed by the realization that you can't possibly return to your fondue looking like this. Something considerably more presentable is clearly in order. Clean and freshly humbled, you wander back through the market beneath walls covered in Zellige, thousands of individually hand-chiseled tiles fitted into geometric patterns so intricate
that no two walls in the city are ever quite the same, and you make the rookie mistake of admiring a copper tray a little too openly. Within seconds, you are locked into a negotiation with a merchant who has clearly been sharpening this particular skill since long before you were born. Look up first, before the negotiation properly begins, and study the Zellige work framing the stall around you. Each individual tile started life as a larger, plain glazed square before a craftsman hand-chipped it, piece by piece, into the precise small shape needed to fit a specific spot within the larger design, a process demanding both mathematical precision and enormous patience, since a single mistake means an entire tile, sometimes an entire section, needs to be started over. The finished patterns fold stars into hexagons, into 8-pointed shapes, with a mathematical rigour that predates computer-aided design by roughly 1,000 years, achieved entirely through hand tools, careful measurement, and an artisanal tradition passed down through generations of the same specialised families. Your admiring glance at that copper tray, meanwhile, has already been noticed, and the merchant is already in motion, lifting it down, polishing an invisible smudge off its surface with his sleeve, and naming a price roughly triple what he actually expects to receive. This opening figure isn't dishonesty so much as the established first move in a conversation with well-understood rules, a bit like the opening bid in an auction that everyone present knows isn't the final number. You're expected to counter with something considerably lower, prompting a wounded theatrical sigh, a brief explanation of the tray's obviously superior craftsmanship, and perhaps a gesture toward his children's uncertain future, should he possibly accept such an insulting offer. This back and forth can stretch on for a genuinely surprising length of time. Tea sometimes offered midway through as a strategic pause, giving both parties a moment to recalibrate their position while maintaining the warm, hospitable tone that somehow coexists peacefully alongside some fairly aggressive financial negotiation. Walking away, even part way, functions as a legitimate and commonly used tactic, frequently prompting the merchant to call out a noticeably improved price just as you reach the edge of his stall, timing that feels suspiciously well rehearsed, no matter how many times you fall for it. Try, for a moment, imagining this exact negotiation playing out at a shop back home, calmly haggling over the listed price of a toaster while the cashier sighs dramatically about his children's future. You'd be escorted out within minutes. Here it's simply how commerce functions, an entire economy built on relationship, performance, and mutual respect for a game everyone involved understands they're playing. You eventually settle on a price only slightly higher than you'd hoped, and considerably lower than his opening offer, and the merchant, satisfied, insists you were clearly born to haggle. You suspect, strongly, that he tells every single customer exactly that. As the light fades, watchmen begin closing the great wooden gates of the Medina one by one, sealing the old city off for the night, the way it has been sealed every single night for centuries. The hammering stops. The haggling stops. Somewhere behind you, the library's doors are locked, its manuscripts left in the dark to quietly outlast yet another day, and yet another century, long after you and everyone you have met today are gone. Watch the process unfold from a quiet corner near your fonduque, heavy wooden doors swinging shut on iron hinges worn smooth from centuries of exactly this same nightly closing. Watchmen moving methodically from gate to gate as the last stragglers hurry through before each one seals for the night. This nightly ritual served real defensive purposes historically, controlling exactly who could enter or leave the walled city after dark, a security measure that feels almost quaint now, watching it performed with the same unhurried, practiced routine of someone locking up a shop rather than defending an entire settlement. The city's sounds fade gradually rather than all at once. The coppersmiths finished hammering some time ago, their tools cleaned and stored until morning. The tannery workers have long since climbed out of their vats, the tannery itself now sitting quiet and considerably less pungent under the cooling evening air. Even the mules seem to have settled somewhere out of sight, their daytime clattering replaced by an occasional distant bray that echoes, oddly peaceful, through streets that spent the entire day roaring with commerce. Somewhere behind you, you know without needing to check, the mosque's courtyard sits equally still, its fountain still trickling quietly to itself, its library shelves holding their 1,000-year-old secrets in patient, undisturbed darkness. You think back over everything the day handed you, the confusion of that first gate, the quiet reverence of standing inside the world's oldest library, the overwhelming assault of the tannery, the surprising intimacy of a stranger scrubbing your back raw, the tea, glass after impossibly sweet glass of it, the bread still warm from a neighbourhood oven, the negotiation over a copper tray you probably paid too much for, regardless of how skilled you thought you were being. None of it felt like the version of Morocco you might have expected walking in this morning. All of it felt, somehow, considerably more real. Somewhere out past these walls, the wider world continues turning at whatever pace it always turns at. Empires rising and falling, technologies arriving and reshaping everything they touch.
And yet here, behind these gates, in this particular walled pocket of the world, something has managed to persist essentially unchanged for well over 1,000 years. Students still arguing in that same courtyard, scribes still copying pages by hand, a library still quietly, faithfully guarding its own impossibly old collection against the wear of time itself. You settle back into your narrow fonduque bed, the city finally hushed around you, and think that whatever comes next in your own life, it will have to work fairly hard to top a single day spent here. So tonight, as you sink back into your own bed, safely far from the tanneries, the tea, and the several strangers who've now seen you at your least composed, take a moment to think about what a place like Fez actually asks of the people who call it home. It asks patience, from the scribes copying page after page by candlelight. It asks precision, from tile cutters chiseling stars out of stone, one small piece at a time. It asks memory, from students who carry entire libraries in their heads because paper was too precious to waste on notes. And somehow, out of all that quiet, relentless effort, a city built something that has simply refused to stop working for well over 1,000 years. There's something worth carrying with you in that. This wasn't a monument built by an empire flexing its muscle. It was built, in large part, by one woman with an inheritance and a stubborn sense of purpose, sustained since then by generations of ordinary people who believed, quietly
and without much fanfare, that keeping a book alive was worth the trouble. Travel tends to do that. It reminds you that the world is full of people who built extraordinary things out of nothing more than conviction and a very long attention span. So be grateful tonight for your soft mattress, your climate control that doesn't rely on a strategically placed window, and a toothbrush that didn't require a trip to a tannery to earn. But maybe spare a small thought, too, for a courtyard on the other side of the world, where a fountain is still quietly trickling, where a library is still guarding pages older than most nations, and where somebody, right now, is very possibly being poured a fifth glass of tea they never asked for. Sleep well. The gates are closed. The city can watch over itself tonight.